Can you describe what it was like that time when you did stand up for the first time in college in Washington, and you said you bombed? I mean, what was that like, and how did you wind up having the courage to do it again?
I think it's the same answer for both. I've suppressed it. It's no longer a memory. I can't even recall the specific jokes. So a couple of my buddies in college recruited me and convinced me to get up on stage. And what I didn't know back then, stand-up comedy on the stage is a true art form. You have to write out jokes, you have to practice them, you have to workshop them. And I felt like, I can kind of shoot from the hip. I can tell some topical jokes about what was going on at the time. And it fell flat. It fell really flat. And I wasn't booed, but I remember internalizing that failure so much to the point where I essentially said, I'll never do this again.
What did that feel like?
It felt embarrassing and utterly humiliating. I walked out and my friends didn't even talk to me. We just it's like we walked back to our house in silence. So obviously
they couldn't even rib you, they felt so bad.
Yeah, they're like, let's go get a beer or something. But like being a parent, as you know, Charles, you have to let go immediately and move on. In retrospect, looking at how I began my comedy career was very helpful in my trial attorney life.
Morning, Vilaska.
Morning. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to have this conversation. Wondering if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Well, my name is Vilaska Nguyen, and I have been working at the Public Defender's Office here in San Francisco for over 15 years. And I started at my office as a research fellow, then a misdemeanor attorney for a couple years, and now I'm a felony trial lawyer. So I've handled everything from low-level drug possession to murder cases. So that's essentially my working background, and I went to law school here in San Francisco, and this is where I live with my family.
You related a story about Jeff Adachi at the Asian American Criminal Trial Lawyers Association dinner the other night that described your path to getting into that research role at first. Would you mind describing what that was?
Oh my gosh. Yes, when I was a research attorney, I was one of two very, elite fellows that worked in our office as post-bar fellows. So before I got hired on into our office as a misdemeanor lawyer, I was given the opportunity to kind of prove my mettle as a volunteer attorney. We have a traditional VAP program, which lasts for about 4 months. And during that time, I tried 5 cases.
Wow.
On my last case, I was litigating an assault with force trial. And my, final interview with Jeff was that closing argument. And he came in, and I remember my intern passing me a Post-it that said, "Don't look now, but Jeff is here." Because I was really just keyed in on my closing and, frantically writing down notes. My client was here, and the interpreter was right next to him. So when I turned and got a head nod from Jeff, just for about 5 to 10 seconds, I was mortified. But once I stood up and started giving my closing arguments, I settled in. And there was a point where I feel like I was making a lot of great arguments and really breaking down, the government's whole theory against my client. And I turned to Jeff, expecting that same acknowledgement, and he was asleep. He was totally asleep, which I found is actually good when he is in a very long hearing or observing. It was endearing looking back on it, but he had heard enough where I was hired shortly after that trial. And despite him falling asleep in the middle of my closing, he remembered every single word. So for some reason, he was able to give me all this very detailed critical feedback from my whole closing presentation, which is pretty phenomenal. It was so Jeff.
He must have felt relaxed because he saw that the office's client was in good hands.
Yes, that's what I told myself then and now. But yeah, he was very proud of me, and I remember Judge Muntor was the presiding judge, and it was great. The judge even sent a letter to Jeff after that trial, because it ended up in an acquittal, and I put a lot of work into that case, and I felt very proud with the outcome, because it was an Asian American older gentleman who was homeless here in Chinatown, and he essentially was just trying to find shelter in a bookstore. And once some employees kind of overreacted to what he looked like and his identity, he reacted in self-defense. So I was really proud of how we presented that story and ultimately the result.
Congratulations, what a result.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm still pretty proud about it.
You must have felt pretty nervous. I mean, in effect, that was your final job interview.
Like I said, I was nervous, and it was very fleeting. I think now the times where I get the most nervous probably last maybe 5 to 10 minutes when the veneer is walking into the courtroom. I'll look at people's shoes, I'll look at their books, I'll look at how they dress, and I'll make all these wild, radical assumptions about how they vote, how they live their day-to-day, to the point where it really preoccupies my analytical senses. And once everyone settles in, and once I can take a look at who's seated, where I'm about to go with my voir dire, then it's back to square one and I'm fine.
What have you found is the best way for you as an attorney to get an intuition, a sense about your potential jurors?
I think as we get older, I'm 41, and I really resist the idea that I'm becoming an outdated dinosaur. The jury pool is never wrong, regardless of who ends up in the veneer. And I think as a trial attorney, the goal is to constantly learn how the best way we could communicate, and that means reaching out to young jurors, seeing how they speak, understanding how they talk, so that when, I do envision like talking to a jury is like just talking to someone at a coffee shop. It has to be really conversational. I want to speak the least amount so everyone else can talk as much as possible, so I can get a real sense and impression of who they are. It's arbitrary. Sometimes judges will give me a very strict boundary in terms of time and what I can voir dire on or question on. So even within those arbitrary boundaries, you have to be as loose and open, and I guess the communication has to flow as much as possible. And that means changing as I get older, learning the nuances of pop culture, how young people think. And I think it's wild to think about it in terms of our traditional sense of going through law school, learning how to write motions and speaking to people. I really do believe jurors are always in the right. So we have to adapt and accommodate the way they communicate.
And what does that mean in the context of criminal defense law, that jurors are always in the right?
Like in my personal life, I don't want to say millennials are need to get with the program, and that's me being like this old curmudgeon yelling at someone like, get off my lawn. But I think, young folks really know how to advocate for themselves, and sometimes that can be mischaracterized as being selfish, and I think that's wrong. And I think that is an example of how I can adapt and learn how this younger demographic communicates. So there's a million different ways to look at a million different people, and I have to be as open as possible to keep a receptive mind whoever walks through the courtroom, because ultimately they're going to be these individuals who are ultimately going to be the 12 prospective jurors, the fact finders on my trial. They have to be the best ones, and sometimes, as we know, just with racial and the implicit bias that is inherent with our criminal justice system, we're not going to get a cross-section, the perfect cross-section of the community when my clients, where they come from, what they look like, who they are, when they look at the jury, it's not going to be a jury they would inherently trust. So there's no margin of error in terms of maximizing and finding the most ideal jury to preside over a case.
As a trial attorney, as a criminal defense attorney, what are the most important aspects that you seek out in a juror?
That can change case to case without divulging too many trade secrets. Like there might be a case where I don't feel very strong about the majority of jurors. I'll get a list and I can see who's coming down the line. If it's a serious case, I also have questionnaires. I have the benefit of a 6 to 10 page document where I really do see their values, their philosophies, their life experiences. So there may be a situation where I know, I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to get a unanimous verdict. So I have to strategize to get individuals who are going to be so polarizing that I know there's not going to be a conviction. That's a strategy. I always envision at the outset of a trial what my perfect juror would be. But as we all know, the practice never comports to our romanticized idea of what jurors end up in the box. So it really depends. Sometimes I feel like I have the perfect jury, and it's not that way. Sometimes I feel like I picked the most ideal juror, and in the middle of a trial, the way she looks at me and my client, and the way the evidence is coming in, I'm pretty confident that I made a mistake, only to know that she was on our side the whole time. And that happened to me in an attempted homicide case. So you never know. You just have to I have to use my experience, my common sense, and my best judgment in that moment.
As a trial attorney, you have an opportunity to observe potential jurors as they walk in. You'll see what they carry in with them. You'll look at their shoes. You'll look at how they present themselves. And then during voir dire, you'll have a chance to interact, hear the words from their own mouths. Sometimes you'll have a 6-page jury questionnaire. But during trial, all you see is their body language.
Yes.
Whether they're smiling at you, smiling at their client, folding their arms. Over those 15 years of experience selecting jurors, do you have any instances where you were really fundamentally surprised?
So, I think early on, like I said, it's so unpredictable. I mean, you know this, being in trial and litigating cases. I think the biggest toss-up is when a juror will fall asleep in the middle of the case, whether it's the prosecution delivering evidence. And this is not like Law and Order, where every single shot is set up so dramatically, where jurors are seated, at the end of their chairs. There's a lot of lulls in trial. So I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's really long, drawn out. But when there are jurors that consistently fall asleep, it is a complete toss-up, because when they wake up, sometimes they'll say guilty or not guilty. I remember it was like a real basic undercover police officer selling or buying narcotics from a purported drug dealer. And the case essentially involved a pretty big missing piece of evidence. And there was argument and theories where this evidence went, and there was one juror who fell asleep right away at the beginning of this trial. When we were able to speak with him after the trial, after the jury was relieved of their duty, he had made up his mind because he could not convict unless that evidence was there. Obviously, he was receptive, but that was a big deal for him. So I felt like I dodged a bullet, but on the flip side, I've seen it go the other way. So when I see jurors kind of nod off, it scares me a little bit. But what you mentioned, the typical body language, if someone is smiling and nodding while I'm making a point, and then looking at the district attorney with disdain, that's pretty close to winning that juror over. And when a juror does that to me, it's very rare that they're on my side, which has happened. It happened with that attempted murder trial that I just referenced. So, I mean, simple body language means a lot, and you can pick up on those things too during jury selection. And that's something you'll never read on a transcript. I'll be looking over here while a juror is talking on the other side of the courtroom, and you can see the way individuals are reacting. You can get a sense of their emotion and their tone and how they're receiving the case, the big issues of the case.
I think being a public defender was your first full-time job out of law school.
Yes.
When was it in your life, or if it was in law school, that point in law school when you firmly fix in your mind, I know this is what I want to do?
That's an interesting question. I think when I did death penalty work for the state public defender's office here in San Francisco, and that was in my second year of law school. We did not step foot in the courtroom, but we did intensive research and writing for habeas and direct appeals where individuals were already on death row. But the reason why I came to law school was actually for policy reform. I went to the University of Washington, graduated in 2000, and my first real job as an adult was working at the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs in Seattle. So I worked as a legislative liaison and a community outreach coordinator in the city. So during our legislative session in Olympia, I would work on bills that affected the Asian American community, civil rights issues that aligned with what the commission was trying to do. And some of my mentors were very prominent, awesome Asian American community leaders, Velma Valoria, Kip Takuda. Those were two individuals that really took me under their wing. And I think they had a sense or a hope that I would go to law school and come back and run for a local office and help the community even further. But when I came to law school here in San Francisco at USF, I fell in love with public defender work. I don't think I fell in love with the courtroom aspect until I actually interned with the office that I'm working at, and that was in my third year. So I worked in a clinic at USF doing misdemeanor work, and then I worked with an experienced felony trial lawyer at her office where I was arguing motions, working up cases, and that's where it really clicked. So I felt like this is what I want to do.
Well, that's quite a path from being a legislative liaison in Washington State working on APIA issues, then doing state death penalty work, which is research. It's research and writing. And then, from there to, learn that you enjoy the courtroom work. What was it, if you recall, about the courtroom work that you learned was appealing to you?
the first day I interned with the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, I met my supervising attorney, Henry Doring, at Civic Center. And he was starting a case where our client was charged with the unlawful sale of marijuana to an undercover police officer. And the theory of the case was essentially nullification, because this undercover police officer had this really long, drawn-out exchange with our client, who initially didn't want to sell to him. But because the police officer had made mention that he was sick, really needed the marijuana, our client sold it to him. And this was a client who was very vocal, a very colorful individual, so much so that he would always stand up and walk into the well area where my supervising attorney was, to whisper something to him or to even talk to the jury. So right away, I was given the responsibility of client control. And client control means calming down our client, advising him, and letting him know that we're handling the case. It ultimately resulted in an acquittal.
Wow.
He was completely enamored and loved the defense team. So that was my first real experience, seeing that I can make an impact, I can be an advocate and succeed at it. But I really enjoyed the work. It was gratifying. So I think all these little experiences just incrementally added up and kept guiding me to the public defender work.
And so by the end of law school, you related a story that that you didn't immediately get the job offer that you were hoping for, and I think you said it was Jeff Adachi suggested that you volunteer as an attorney. What was your reaction to that?
My reaction, I was pretty livid. And looking back, man, that was over 15 years ago. I was a young punk, and I had gone through this research fellowship where I felt I learned so much, but I had no trial work. And looking back, I understand it's really hard to project how someone with no trial work is going to perform in a very elite position, especially with our office. So Teresa Cafesi at the time was our chief attorney. She's now a judge in the San Francisco Superior Court, and she had pulled me aside and essentially recommended that I do the VAP program. And I was like, fuck that. No way. You just denied me this position to be here. Why would I give you any more of my time? And that was just the youth talking, looking back.
It's a natural reaction.
It's a natural reaction, and I had to voice my concern. So I had already gone through a pretty intense, rigorous interview process where I met with a panel of attorneys who I knew all of them, and then I sat down with Teresa and Jeff, and they opted to hire someone else, 2 other people ahead of me. And I was pretty upset and disappointed, to say the least. But then when I calmed down, I realized that I wasn't ready to walk away from the office. I remember getting 2 offers at the time. One was to work in Fresno, and one was to work for a white-collar criminal defense firm here in the city. And it didn't feel right. If I was trusting my instincts, I would have been more comfortable walking away from the office after doing the VAP program. So fortunately, it worked out.
You were a legislative liaison in Washington State, and your supervisors, your mentors, hoped that you would come back and seek elective office. And I know that outside of the law in your precious free time, you choose to do stand-up comedy work.
Yes.
So, did you, was that did you know that the stand-up performance aspect of work was something that you wanted to incorporate into your professional life?
did I want to incorporate my stand-up performance into being a trial attorney?
No, not necessarily that, but you chose a route where being good on your feet is actually quite important, probably more so in your line of law than just about any other. And so did you know that would be something that you would enjoy?
It was something I knew I was really good at. And let me just be clear, I did stand-up comedy when I was at the University of Washington, I believe my sophomore year, and I bombed. And I checked it off the list and said, I'll never return to this ever again. So I really felt that was completely separate from advocacy, professional advocacy, especially being a legislative liaison. So I would actually appear before like these chamber hearings with the state Senate or the state House of Representatives, and I would set up individual meetings to meet with legislators to advise or to at least share our commission's position. And I knew I was pretty charismatic and I was pretty effective at being an advocate, and I really loved the issues. I still love policy reform, and I know it's something where we could see more widespread impact. So that being said, I knew using my voice was powerful and it was effective. When I was in college, I was the president of a really radical ethnic studies group called the Ethnic Studies Student Association. And I remember Wolfgang Puck and his wife, Barbara Lazaroff, had set up this Pan-Asian restaurant in downtown Seattle, but they had this giant Chinaman like portrait in the foyer, like the Fu Manchu, all yellow, slanty eyes. And what started off as a couple dozen students, activists, it turned into 3-4 protests where we got so much great local media attention. I appeared on a local political show, and it ultimately resulted in the restaurant shutting down and reopening under a different name down the street. So I was really proud of my activism, and I knew I was really good at advocacy. And seeing what I accomplished at the commission, I felt I could accomplish a lot more once I became a lawyer. But like life, things change, things deviate. And when I did find stand-up comedy, it was so different from being a trial lawyer that actually helped me be a trial lawyer a little bit better. Like bombing, there's no greater feeling or overwhelming feeling than bombing in front of a crowd. But like being a parent, as you know, Charles, you have to let go immediately and move on. So that, in retrospect, looking at how I began my comedy career was very helpful in my trial attorney life.
Can you describe what it was like that time when you did stand up for the first time in college in Washington, and you said you bombed? I mean, what was that like, and how did you wind up having the courage to do it again?
I think it's the same answer for both. I've suppressed it. It's no longer a memory. I can't even recall the specific jokes, but I remember it was for some competition, and a couple of my buddies, because I've always been really funny in small settings, cracking jokes. I feel like that's the arena of real comedy. If you can make all your friends laugh to the point where people are all falling over. So a couple of my buddies in college recruited me and convinced me to get up on stage. And what I didn't know back then, stand-up comedy on the stage is a true art form. You have to write out jokes, you have to practice them, you have to workshop them. And I felt like, I can kind of shoot from the hip. I can tell some topical jokes about what was going on at the time. And it fell flat. It fell really flat. And I wasn't booed, but I remember internalizing that failure so much to the point where I essentially said, I'll never do this again.
What did that feel like?
It felt embarrassing and utterly humiliating. I walked out and my friends didn't even talk to me. We just it's like we walked back to our house in silence. So obviously
they couldn't even rib you, they felt so bad.
Yeah, they're like, let's go get a beer or something. I think I'm probably over dramatizing it. Fast forward to about 5 years ago, my friend who's a defense attorney who's into film and art convinced me to do an open mic at Brainwash, which is a laundromat and performing art space that was 2 blocks from the public defender's office. It unfortunately closed down last year, but it was a real staple in the San Francisco comedy scene. So it was a 3-minute open mic. I got a couple chuckles. A comic there saw me and recruited me to be on a show. And over the next 3 months, I feel like I was kind of haphazardly just flailing in the dark, and I really didn't know what I was doing, but I, to a certain degree, enjoyed it. And I was bombing, and I was still internalizing a lot of that same failure, embarrassment, and humiliation. But I remember it was about 2 months after that first open mic where I did really well. And there were people outside of the show asking me when was my next performance, and asking how they could get information about me. And that's when I kind of realized, like, wow, this is really exhilarating, and there might be a little bit something more to it. To the point, the following week, I was on a double date. Rianne and I were with our friends, and we were at the chapel in the Mission, and we were just listening to a band, and the security guard recognized me from that show. And my friends didn't even know I was doing stand-up comedy. So I think that experience propelled me to pursue it a little bit more. And then as I was doing probably 3 or 4 mics a week shortly thereafter, I got an AT&T commercial. Wow. That was really lucrative, was super fun, and it kind of opened up my eyes about the business side of the profession. So.
And how did that happen, that you go from doing 4 or 5 open mics, and then you're representing a major corporation in a commercial?
I think a lot of it was happenstance, but I don't want to dismiss this to complete luck, because I feel like taking those creative risks put my face, my name, and my identity out there. So it's a really supportive comic community, and someone who knew the producer of this commercial essentially connected me to them. And I was really naive when I spoke to this producer over the phone initially. They wanted me to audition. They were asking me all this information, and I was really dismissive. I kind of scoffed at him, like, I'm not going to do all that. So these producers came to our house and auditioned the entire family over the course of 2 days. And then all of a sudden we get a call that AT&T, the client, and the directors, amazing couple who are nationally prominent, they all chose us to be these principal actors in this commercial that was going to be nationally televised.
Wow. And what was that like? So, you and Rianne are both working full time as attorneys. Within months of starting your side gig as a stand-up comedian, you find yourself on a set with your family. That must have felt surreal.
Well, it was very surreal. My portion of the commercial was shot at SFO. So I was like the business guy reading a bedtime story, and the campaign was Strong Can, and there were all these narratives within the commercial And our portion was Strong can read a bedtime story from Gate 7. So my role was a dad reading a bedtime story on a device, and Rianne and the kids were back home interacting with me. So it was Saturday or Sunday morning at like 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, and I shot there for almost 7 to 8 hours.
Wow.
And I was pretty naive about it. Like when I showed up, I saw the craft services being set up. So I was, setting up the food with these people because I was the first one there. And then when all these background actors showed up, once they figured out I was the principal actor, they kept talking, they were jockeying to be around me. And one of the assistants, the PA assistants came up to me and broke it down. I was like, hey, these people are trying to strategize to get close to you so that if they're in the shot, if A, B, and C happen, that they can also get residuals during the commercial.
Oh, I see.
So I was blown away. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is nuts. But I was just myself, I was cracking jokes. I was mic'd up much like this. And a few hours into the shoot, I see all these people laughing in the background where the director and the sound people are and all the clients are. And I realize everyone is listening to me crack all these terrible jokes in between shots. And then that's when I kind of I froze up very momentarily, like there are a lot of eyes on me and ears listening to every single word I say. But it was a great experience. When we first discovered the magnitude of the advertising campaign, one of the other parents in my daughter's kindergarten class texted us and was like, why is Vivian in the centerfold of Time magazine?
Wow.
So they took a still, and that was a part of their campaign, was the print. And shortly thereafter, we started seeing the commercial on TV.
Amazing.
Yeah, that was pretty surreal. But it was interesting too, because there was no working footage of our son Russell. So every time it came up, he was really mad. So we had to quickly...
He said, where's my residual?
Yeah, he was like, it's not fair. So we would have to change the channel and turn off the TV when it came on.
So you had the experience of doing stand-up in college and didn't go well. You checked that box, you checked off your list. I'm not going to do that again. Someone invites you to do stand-up in San Francisco, and then it wasn't really until later when you felt like you weren't just feeling your way in the dark. How did you keep it up and keep up the desire to do stand-up when your first experiences with it were disappointing?
I think it's twofold, professionally and personally. I got a lot of personal gratification out of the performing aspect, but I felt I could never go all in because I felt being a public defender and even a dad, I really restricted myself from sharing a lot of stories that meant a lot to me. So I feel I began comedy with a lot of conflict. And if I have to kind of paint a picture, I had one foot out the door, probably the first few years of doing comedy. And, Jeff Adachi was one of my biggest supporters. And I feel like I may have quit had I not had his support. And he came to one of my shows, and this was years ago. It was at the Milk Bar on Haight, and I feel symbolic because the first time I met Jeff was in front of Amoeba across the street when he was campaigning against Kamiko Burton way back when. So that was the first time I met him. Fast forward, he's listening to me for the first time, and I didn't think it was such a great set or performance. I thought it was okay, But I will never forget what he told me after the show. He said, "I hope you never quit comedy." And that really resonated for me because he followed my career, my trajectory, and he was always so supportive. He would text me, he would like ask me questions, to the point where he would give me this perpetual mantra, like, "What's holding you back?" And I remember on a lot of occasions, I'd be like, "It's work, I'm in trial right now, there's a lot holding me back." But I credit him with so much support and encouragement. So just talking about comedy though, I think it took me a few years to even embrace the term comedy or being a comic. And after I embraced being a comic, it took me a while to really be okay with what my comic identity was. And only recently, probably this past year, I finally gave myself license to be silly, which is something I've always inherently valued, just sitting around with my friends, making them laugh and being a dad. So I feel like I've reached a point, and probably most comics will go through this, like 6 months, 1 to 2 years in, but because I had such a protracted comedic development, it took me a while to figure out what my identity was.
One thing I enjoy about your comedy is that you try to convey a bigger picture. At least that's my impression, and you do that through the storytelling, the setting, the jokes that you choose don't simply end in surprise, but along the way you tell a narrative. If that's true, why do you choose to craft your art that way?
I have to be true to who I am, and I'm a storyteller. And I think you can tell a story with punchlines and tags. And I think what I've always struggled with is, what story should I tell? And I feel there is a real challenge if I'm trying to be too topical, or if I'm trying to convey a social message. That may not be the best way to craft a story. So I will really look at all my favorite stories that relate to different subjects, as being a dad, being a husband, being a public defender, just being out on the street. And if the story itself is true to my values and my perception, then I feel like it's worthy of workshopping or working out. Because I do feel, if you look at like Constance Wu or Randall Park or Margaret Cho, if they're just in Hollywood, the fact that they're present, having an Asian American in a very traditional white media institution, is powerful. And I feel like everyone has a different story, and sometimes like I will gravitate to the political commentary. I love Michelle Wolf. Michelle Wolf is hilarious. The things that she talks about are so resonating. I also like Tig Notaro. It depends on what type of mood, but when I'm looking at the movement of Asian American artists and performers, the fact that there's a face in this institution is powerful. And I think what I'm hoping we'll see over time are more faces, more stories. So just on a personal level, I feel that it might be distracting to try to have like all these issues addressed in one character and one story, because then we run the risk of having like this after school special that's not taken serious at all. So that's kind of like my comedic development in terms of sharing my story, and a lot of them happen to be hilarious. And I think when you take a step back, it's very exceptional hearing just even a public defender who's a comedian tell stories about clients without disparaging them, but talking about real humanity, things that affect all of us.
One thing that I observe about Asian American comics is that today, Asian American comics can exist, at least some of them, without making their identity and their race the butt of the joke. And it's really refreshing to see that happen. Ali Wong, a San Francisco native, she delivers a hilarious sets where she doesn't shy away from race, but it's not the speaking and conveying race as a joke to a majority audience. That's not the point of her set. I'll admit that I watched Ken Jeong the other day, who I went to college with, and he grew up in the Carolinas, and I remember a distinct feeling of being disappointed that that's where he was, in the sense that he kind of made being different and Asian the joke. And but I would think that if it weren't for the Margaret Cho's and the Ken Jeongs, we wouldn't have the Ali Wongs today.
Absolutely, and I think that's still the case. I think it's very dangerous to take a comics joke, and I'm not saying you're taking Ken Jeong's jokes out of context. I remember when he first came on scene, he was a comedy partner with Zach Galifianakis down in LA, and I actually identify with him. Here's a doctor who's still practicing medicine, but he's in the entertainment industry. On multiple occasions he was ready to walk away from, but for personal reasons, and the support he had amongst other actors in comics. And I remember there was a set he did at the Apollo in front of an African American crowd, and a lot of the jokes that really resonated with the crowd were his jokes about being an OBGYN and how women just need to have better grooming. It wasn't sensationalized Asian stereotypes, and he does do some of that, and all I can say is that's not my brand of comedy, but I know that it takes a lot of hard work to get to that point, and there is still something to say about people who he impacts and influences are going to laugh, they're going to accept him, and he has a bridge to convey a bigger story, as ironic as that sounds. So I think it's still important to have individuals like Ken Jeong, even though our comedy may not be very similar.
You mentioned that one similarity between doing stand-up and doing your work as a public defender is being able to move on from a bomb. How, if at all, has the entertainment work and comedy helped you as a public defender?
I think my biggest takeaway has been the inflection of my tone and remaining more conversational. I know I am the most powerful when I can rest within my conversational tone. And when I began comedy, I was giving my performances like I was giving a closing argument. Sometimes overly professional tone, really intense, looking at audiences as if I'm trying to bully them into an emotional response, which is not how comedy works. And I learned very quickly. So trying to strike the right tone so you're conveying confidence and you're relaxed on stage has translated really well being a public defender. So I feel like I've taken more out of comedy in the courtroom as opposed to being a comedy pulling skills and experience from being a public defender. As odd as that sounds, I think that's the truth.
I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about your work as a public defender. In San Francisco, the the San Francisco Office of Public Defender has a reputation of being fearless and also encouraging their trial lawyers to take cases to trial. I wonder if that impression, that reputation, is true, what you think about it, and what it means for your work.
It's true, and I believe in it, and I want to dismiss any type of stigma, or particularly negative stigma, to that, because I think one of the connotations, and I'm not saying that you're implying that in any way, is that just pushing so much to trial ends up compromising our own representation of a client. Because I really do believe that going to trial is a result of failed negotiations. And if we can negotiate a fantastic offer or a case to be dropped, that's great. However, I feel what we determine the best value of a case or the best representation will ultimately be a reflection of our trial work. I think, when I first started, I was a misdemeanor attorney. I tried about 30 cases my first 2 years. And then you go up through the hierarchy of felonies until you get enough experience where you can handle the serious ones, like sexual assaults, murders, cases where people are facing life in prison. And I think it becomes challenging because quite often there's no other option but to try a case.
In those 15 years, I wonder, are there cases that stand out for you that have been the most impactful for you personally?
The one case that comes to mind is an individual, Michael Steele. And I think this was 2010, 2011. And he was an African American in his mid to late 50s. He had schizophrenia. He was a drug addict. And he was charged with possession for sale of heroin. And the heroin on him was about 1/3 of a gram of heroin. And this is not one of those sexy cases that involved murder or a lot of media attention, but it really was a reflection of the things that I really find so abhorrent about our criminal justice system: mass incarceration, the racism inherent in terms of arrests and prosecutions, and also the war on drugs. Our state laws, as they relate to punishment, is a real reflection and mirror all the things that happened in the 80s when our country began taking this tough on crime approach. Michael Steele was sentenced to 14 years in state prison. And it still rattles me thinking about this experience. And I think there were a lot of things that went wrong, but my biggest concern and challenge was, I can win 10, 20 more cases, but if the framework of the law doesn't change, then we're going to continually run into this problem. So I had a great opportunity to work on a bill. State Senator Holly Mitchell from Los Angeles crafted a bill called RISE, Repeal Ineffective Sentencing Enhancements, that dealt particularly with what Michael Steele had been sentenced to. And when it was first up a few years ago, it didn't pass out of the Senate. But the following year, I worked with the ACLU, the Drug Policy Alliance, and Holly Mitchell's office, and we were able to pass it. So the sentencing enhancements that applied to Michael Steele were no longer on the books. So that's one thing I'm really proud about my advocacy work, but also my office allowed me, not only allowed me, but they supported me in that fight to remove the war on drugs, to fight against it.
when you entered law school, you had the thought of returning to public policy, and you're engaged in defense of individual cases now, but one of the highlights that you identify is a public policy achievement where you're able to change the law on ineffective sentencing enhancements. Any thought on returning to that path that you had originally envisioned for yourself?
Yeah, the thought is fleeting though. I raised that story because it was one of the most disheartening cases I've had to deal with. I've won a lot of cases. I've handled more high-profile cases, but I think it left me really disheartened and disillusioned about the system. And I was able to get that back because I kind of tapped into some of my old skill set and did some policy work. I don't ever shut the door on any opportunity. However, I'm pretty blessed and fortunate where I am and what I'm able to do, and the latitude my office gives me in doing important work like that policy work while still being a trial lawyer.
So imagining that you're Governor Nguyen, the state of California,
yes,
and as another side gig, what's the one public policy change that you would make as it relates to criminal defense law?
Like I said, Charles, I'm not running for office. I'm not into public policy. In terms of criminal justice law, man, that's a really loaded question. I think, we're on the right path. No more death penalty. I think, Bryan Stevenson is one of my heroes. And he has this great analogy of, 1 in 10 death row inmates are innocent. Like, we would never accept that type of statistical error if we're, taking a flight, getting in an airplane. But here we are, complicit in this institution that murders innocent people. Notwithstanding all the discussion about how racist and unfair it is. So I think, our governor, our state is moving in the right direction on that issue. I think we have a long way to go on the war on crime or the war on drugs. Every legislative session, we're kind of taking a page out of the punishments that are residual and mirror what the national war on drugs was set up to do in the 80s, but I think we still have a long way to go. If I had just to decide what we could do right now is probably end cash bail. I think that would be a first step into really seeing a more fair criminal justice system.
And why cash bail?
Well, we live in a world where, and I'm going to quote Bryan Stevenson, where the rich and guilty can afford justice while the poor and innocent cannot. And that's an absolute reflection of cash bail and how our criminal justice system works. So when someone who has barely anything has so much to lose, being in jail for even a week or two, family, job, housing, they're going to accept a conviction just to get out, so they don't lose those really important things. And I know if this type of issue affected any of our families, we would be, the first to get behind that type of revolution or movement. So I think it's not the most mainstream criminal justice issue, but it's the one that is practical and would affect lives immediately.
Well, and in California, we're probably closer to eliminating cash bail than in any other state.
I feel, yes, that's a true statement. However, I feel like we're still a long way from that. San Francisco is always going to be a a little different from how the other counties across the state work, but I feel we're in a position to really set a meaningful example of how, to administer like a fair system of release.
Both you and Jeff Adachi, you channel your beliefs, your advocacy, and your passion outside of the four corners of a legal brief or the courtroom. Wonder if that's something that's just a happenstance, a coincidence, or if it reflects something broader about the work in which you find yourself.
I think it is integral in terms of public defender work. I think it is also something that links all of us in terms of just humanity. If there's a problem or this widespread racism or issue that impacts our community, we want to do something about it. Just because I fight in the courtroom doesn't mean I can't make a difference beyond the courtroom doors. And I feel like one of the best aspects of my job is providing hope for my clients. And these are individuals who experience the most despair, the most marginalized in our community. And to deliver on that hope is very gratifying. I feel that same type of idea in the community could be even more gratifying because so many more people are impacted. And I feel like-minded individuals, especially within ABA, share that same philosophy and mentality.
Having tried dozens and dozens of cases, from possession, DUI, to violent crimes, and over the span of those 15 years that you've been practicing as a public defender, how have you kept up the, kind of the resilience to continue the work and continue to be passionate about the work for each of your clients?
I feel the service, providing the hope, rising above the struggle with a client is one of the greatest feelings in my life. And until that goes away, I don't know how to answer that in any other way. But there's something to say about sitting in the San Bruno jail, which is our county jail satellite location, talking to an individual who's, charged, trying a case of, multiple counts of attempted murder, and not quite figuring out exactly how I'm going to do it, but knowing that we have the shared experience of being Asian American, having daughters the same age, that I was committed to reuniting him with his family. And that's a very powerful story, and that was a motivating factor in terms of exhausting everything that I could within myself to share his story. And he spent years in jail. It was a private case that we took over, and fortunately the trial worked out in his favor, and he was released. The first thing that we did, we walked across the street and got a bowl of pho together. It was awesome.
Turtle Tower?
Turtle Tower. It's our freedom pho. So I don't feel like I need, I'm not saying just marginalizing your own question, I don't need to fabricate like a reason, or I don't need to find anything to get up in the morning. It's something I really enjoy doing. I think my biggest challenge in life is there's so many things that I love, but there's only 24 hours in the day.
Ah, got it.
So if you have like a solution to that, I would love to hear it, Charles.
One thing that strikes me is this thread in your work from, after college, you worked in API-related work as a legislative liaison. You talk about kind of the impact of race and racism as a daily concern and experience that your clients have. Wonder what it is that led you to work that so directly involves your identity and identity issues like race.
All my clients have an experience that I can connect with. My parents were Vietnam War refugees. They left on the fall of Saigon, and they came to a country completely foreign to them, but they did it with the hope of this American dream, this idea of the American dream. And I think the marginalized groups that I represent, African Americans, people of color, these poor individuals, are refugees within their own country. I mean, even if you look at the historical aspects of African Americans fleeing the South to the North, they are refugees within their own nation. And I feel it's a direct connection in terms of a shared experience. And I'm always impressed with my clients because they share so many similar stories of abuse, of abandonment, of trauma at such an early age, yet they have survived it all. And they've survived it because they have phenomenal characters in this metal. And when I connect with them, they entrust me with their story, which is a very powerful responsibility. So I feel, very connected and privileged to represent these individuals.
For a law student that might be considering public defender work, criminal justice work as their profession, what would you say to them? And is there anything surprising about the work that you didn't discover until after you started practicing?
My advice to law students is to become an elite writer and embrace litigation, the courtroom experience. So how I generally run my own internship program, I will have certified law students who can work up like a felony case, a low-level felony case where there's slightly wider margin of error, where the law students can formulate and develop a theory, write a motion, maybe it's a motion to suppress, and cross-examine a police officer and argue that motion during a hearing. So you get a sense about an individual's trajectory and their potential of being a public defender. I don't think there was anything that really surprised me about the work once I became a public defender, because when I was interning as a law student, I was just hit with all kinds of surprises and unpredictable situations, which I love because that dynamic aspect of the job can give an advocate like me an opportunity to kind of get ahead of the pack.
What makes for a meaningful life?
That's a very profound question, and it's actually a question that I think about on a daily basis. And when I approach a decision or an issue that affects my life or my profession or my comedy career, I have to really exercise like this barometer. Will I have any types of regret with my decision? And normally the regret is connected to rejecting an opportunity. So I know that might be oversimplifying it, but one of the challenges in life is I see a lot of fantastic meaningful opportunities. And I think having a meaningful and happy life, I feel very privileged that I have the capacity to be happy, and I've got a great family, a great career, amazing family and friends like you. So I really have to give a lot of thought in terms of, every decision I make. Am I going to regret this if I just continue on doing what I do every day? Will I regret this opportunity because I have to go to LA for like 2 months and I don't even know what's going to come of this entertainment, this particular acting gig? So I really do think about it, and I have the luxury of having a wife that's really supportive and will tell me exactly what I should do and what I will regret. So I think I've been fortunate to have a good partner that functions as my common sense.
Awesome. Thank you, Vilaska.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.